After the previous video that I made about Quebec and the Charter of Values that's being proposed and is probably going to pass, I was speaking to somebody that I knew from Quebec, and we were talking about the issue of Quebec itself. And I was saying that, one, Quebec is not oppressed, and two, that Quebec is actually an oppressor nation itself. And this became a discussion, and it got heated, blah, 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 but it's stayed pretty good. Now, what I wanted to do was go ahead and make a video on this and actually back up what it is that I'm saying when it comes to oppression and Quebec. What do I mean when I say Quebec is not oppressed? Well, there's several criteria by which one would go by to determine whether or not a particular place in a country is oppressed. Now, I am not saying that Quebec was never oppressed. It was very much so, but that is not the case now. As in when you look at the evidence, I see that Quebec is not actually oppressed. Now, keeping in mind, the issue of separation from the rest of Canada is built on the premise of oppression, that they need to be separated based on that kind of oppression. As I don't see that oppression there, I don't see a reason to actually separate from the country. Now let me go on to defend why I think that Quebec is not oppressed. I would reduce it to a number of issues, but just to make this video, not really too long so that people don't watch it. A main issue of, I would say, language and economics. And I would say that economics is actually a very important factor when deciding whether or not a place is oppressed, given that I am a Marxist and that I have a lot of Marxist friends, and it was a Marxist person that I was actually talking to. So I would like to deal with those two particular issues. In Canada, the federal government makes equalization payments to less wealthy Canadian provinces to equalize the province's fiscal capacity, their ability to generate tax revenues. A province that does not receive equalization payments is often referred to as a have province, while one that does is called a have-not province. In 2013 to 14, 6 provinces will receive $16.1 billion in equalization payments from the federal government. Quebec will receive the most from equalization payments in the 2013 to 2014 year, which means Quebec is going to receive more money than it actually brings in. So as we can see from this, at least in terms of Canada versus Quebec, they're not economically exploited. Of course, there's a whole issue of working class, capitalist class, which still remains. But when we're talking about the context in between Quebec and the rest of the country, it's certainly not oppressed. In fact, it receives a great deal of assistance in order to meet its obligations, the same kind of assistance that would be given out to any other province. Now, the other issue I wanted to go by in terms of determining oppression is language, because that has always been a very big thing about the preservation of the French language and the use of it in public spaces and government jobs and stuff like that. Generally, the whole issue of language has been a very big deal, so it is an important thing to include here. That's been completely preserved. They have a right to use it here, the right to use it there. There's French and English schools, state-funded. The preservation of the language is there. You're not punished, or at least it's not legal to punish somebody on the basis of French. So there's no oppression there. The French language is free there to be used. You can make some minor criticisms of places like Alberta, where speaking French might be an issue. But when we're talking about Quebec itself, the Quebec people inside the province, there's no oppression in terms of language. In fact, I would argue that there is oppression against non-French speakers. Particularly, here's one example of where a business owner had to change his signs. An Italian cafe in Quebec City had to replace its menus, signs, wine glasses because his name was spelled in the Italian way with 2 F's. The sign was made that way to reflect the Italian inspiration of the business. The Francophone who owns the cafe was fined $2,000 in order to change the signs. This is literally oppressive to other languages. There's all kinds of non-English signs, at least in Ontario. Check out Markham or Toronto sometime. You can find entire sections of blocks which don't have any English writing at all. The French language is not repressed in any way by the federal government. It's not trying to be wiped out. There's nothing stopping it from being used or being taught. In fact, there's there's money going into making sure that people learn French. There's programs there for immigrants who come in to learn French, the language of where it is that they're immigrating to. So the language is not being oppressed. In fact, there's considerable efforts in order to preserve it. Now I want to move on to the issue of whether or not Quebec is an oppressor nation. Now, it is a nation, it has recognition, the legal standing is there, that's not in question. What's in question here is to whether or not it is oppressive. Now, it should be obvious that it is. It's sitting right in the middle of the first world. It's hard to really claim that much anywhere in the first world is really being oppressed. Now, when I say that, I mean being oppressed by something else. It's sitting in the first world. It has all the benefits and privileges that come with being in the first world. Now, the question is, what oppression does it actually carry out? Like something direct aside from the general economic situation of being in the first world. Now, one of those I would like to note is actually with regards to the indigenous population. I did have somebody try to argue with me. I was saying that Quebec is just as bad with the Aboriginal population as the rest of the country is. And he tried to say that, well, he was part Mi'kmaq, so therefore what, the oppression doesn't exist? So what I thought I would do is go to Statistics Canada and get some information on that. In all provinces and territories, the representation of Aboriginal adults in correctional services exceeds their representation in the general population, with gaps being wider in some jurisdictions than others. For instance, in Quebec, the representation of Aboriginal adults in provincial and territorial sentence custody is 2 times their representation in the province's general population. In Saskatchewan, the representation is even 7 times greater. So even from this, we can see that it's still pretty oppressive towards the Indigenous population. Is it as bad as Saskatchewan? No, it's not. But it is still pretty high, and you can take a look at the data for yourself and make that determination. Quebec, the nation of Quebec, is still oppressive to the Indigenous population, even though they were there first and everything. So in that regards, yes, they are still oppressive. Now, the second point in oppression that I want to make is the issue of imperialism. Canada is an imperialist power, just as pretty much the entire first world is. Quebec mining companies are pushing for war in Afghanistan, and they are pushing to get their companies into Afghanistan to make money and do the same thing that all mining companies do with the repressive things it carries out against people, Indigenous people in South America and whatnot. Now, they push the imperialist war machine in Afghanistan just as, quote-unquote, Anglophone mining companies. I tend to think of them all as just the capitalist class. But if we're going to divide them based on their language or where their headquarters is, yes, the Quebec mining companies are just as bad as the mining companies in the rest of the country. And they, too, have a drive for war in Afghanistan. For those who aren't familiar, Canada is very, very big for mining internationally and actually does have the worst human rights record when it comes to mining internationally. Canadian companies are actually really bad. So in this regard, the oppression that comes from imperialism is still being carried out by Quebec companies, which means they're still imperialists. We should understand here that Quebec is not oppressed. It is an oppressor nation in and of itself. There are many people who believe that Quebec is oppressed, but we have to determine if that's true by going by the material conditions, not perception. One's merely identity and this identity politics is not enough. We have to go according to the material conditions to determine whether or not Quebec is oppressed. And when we can see from looking at it, looking at data, it's not. In fact, it's really not that much different from the rest of Canada in those regards. It receives all the assistance it needs. Obviously all the provinces aren't getting as much assistance as they need, but they're not being treated as, any worse than any other province. So economically, outside the issue of capital and labor, it's not being oppressed. And in terms of language, it already has more than enough to support it as it is. In my view, what I'm seeing from people who do want to separate, and I'm sorry if this is offensive, but this is the way I see it when I go according to what the material conditions are, is basically first world white people claiming that they're oppressed. I mean, this is just not the case. I mean, just look at the Quebec Charter of Values. I mean, this is horribly repressive towards minorities. And in fact, we go into a study that was done back in 2007 as in terms of what percentage of the population thinks, believes, acknowledges that it's racist. In fact, 59% of people in Quebec said that they were racist. 50% of them saying that they were directly racist against Muslims. So, you know, we really can't say Quebec is oppressed. It's just not. There's no material basis there for making the claim. And just one small point that I want to make at the end. If it was so badly oppressed, why does the population keep voting not to separate? Thank you for watching. Go ahead, rate, comment, subscribe, share on various social media. And if you want, there's some other great content here you could check out.